Welcome back to Sticks Tricks. My name is Sticks, and today doing another how-to on my Aprilia Tuareg 660. This is going to be on how to install the heat engine skid plate. And starting off, this is what you get out of the package. You have the two new brackets you'll install that this new skid plate will mount to, and you have the various hardware that's needed to do so. I have the aluminum skid plate here in the black color to go with the the color scheme I'm keeping on my Tuareg. Already I can tell you this is very high quality. The welds are really nice. The finish is really nice on it. It's a good paint job. And with this aluminum one, it is surprisingly light for its, like, I'm just picking it up with one hand here. No big deal. So you can see here it has some venting for the factory catalytic converter, or if you do an aftermarket header setup with no cat, it still will offer some airflow in that area because it'll still get hot in that area, of course. So now let's move on and see what tools you'll need to complete this job. It is a very straightforward installation. You just take your time with the steps and it'll go by in a breeze. So let's get to the tools. So here are the tools you'll need to complete this job. All very basic tools and very easily attainable. So first off, a 13mm wrench, 8mm socket, a 10mm socket. I have a mountain biking multi-tool that I use very regularly, but I do need this for this job because it has a 4mm Allen on it. So you will need a 4mm, like an Allen key, or I'm using that because I don't have a socket version. So this is a 5mm Allen, socket version. You do need a 5mm Allen, as most of the new hardware does use that now. And then if you're like me, I like a paint pen to be able to mark everything once I torque it down. And even in Heat's instructions, it does say you can use a mild thread locker. So I'm just using a blue thread locker there to help with preventing anything loosening up with the engine vibration. And of course, various ratchets if you're gonna use sockets, because obviously you need a way to turn those. So now let's get on to the installation. So first off, we're gonna start by removing the factory exhaust guard and engine skid plate. If you could even say they offer protection, because they are kind of like a soda can. Very thin, flimsy aluminum. But to do that, first off, the exhaust guard here, this is where you need your 4mm Allen. It's just this one bolt, and you just remove that, and then this just slides forward. It kind of just loops, has like a hook, it just hooks into the exhaust right here. So like I said, remove that 4mm, slide this forward, it's gone, it's out of there. And now I figured I would just show you real quick, after you remove this 4mm Allen, this just slides forward. So you can see there's kind of a place there to hook into this tab, and then this tab on the front just rests on this other location to just kind of steady it so it doesn't rattle. So that's all there is to it to remove that. And then you will be left with these rubber tabs, or these rubber caps on these tabs. I'm gonna go ahead and remove them just because I'm sure eventually they will just fall off on their own and cause litter. So I'm just gonna remove them because they won't be seen again or used again once you have that skid plate installed. And as far as the main engine skid plate, to remove that, it's very easy. This is where you'll need your 8mm socket or wrench. You'll remove these two 8mm bolts and these two 8mm bolts. So you do not touch these nuts here, as all these do are secure little rubber dampeners on the other side of the plate. They don't connect to the engine, they just rest on the oil pan. So leave those alone. All you gotta do is take off those four 8mm bolts. And I apologize for the lighting for this video. I am in my relatively dark shed, so I'm trying to experiment with the lighting here to show you as clear as I can where we'll be working. So now that we have the factory skid plates and protection off, you can see the area we'll be working in. So what we're gonna do for this how-to is start from the front of the engine or the front of the machine and work our way back. And by the way, this may be a good time to clean under here, as from off-road riding and even just road riding, a lot of junk and grit and the like will accumulate. So I am going to do a quick little clean under here. But first off, you do need to remove this original bracket. So that means removing these two 10mm bolts. And once we do that, I'll be back with the next steps. Okay, so now that we have the original front bracket and bolts removed, we're going to grab our new front bracket here. And then I already did, but what you need to do, these Allen bolts that come in the packaging, or at least they did for me, they came already threaded in these rubber spacers, I guess you could call them. You need to take these out, but do not get them mixed up with these, because these are actually shorter than these other bolts where you'll use elsewhere. So just keep these four that you removed from these rubber spacers here, just keep them separate. So what we're going to want to do is grab two of these. I already have these prepped with a little bit of the Loctite, just a little. And you're going to want to use these to secure this bracket where this one was, obviously using the same holes that these came out of. I did measure, and these are, once you put them through the bracket, they do thread in a little farther than the factory bolts, but they tighten up and they don't bottom out in the hole, because by all means, there's no real way to kind of mess this job up, but by all means, you don't want to be threading anything that's too long into the threaded oil pan, because you really don't want to risk punching a hole up in the oil pan or damaging threads. But if you did notice that, like as I did, that these are a little bit longer, I'm guessing he did that just so they're additionally stronger. It adds some additional strength, but still using the factory hole depth, if that makes sense. So now let's get under the bike and I'll show securing this up there. Okay, so I've got one of these threaded in, holding up this new bracket. So I've got the other one here. So you're just gonna want to feed it through the hole, line it up with the factory threaded hole. What I like to do is reverse thread until the threads kind of drop in, and then thread it in to make sure you don't cross thread these, because you're really gonna have a bad day if you cross thread these. So as you can see here, just hand tight, which you can really torque these pretty good. It's a pretty wide surface area, but I'm just gonna do it generally tight. The original bolts were not crazy tight, really at all. Actually, I used just a 1/4 inch ratchet. So definitely don't over tighten anything, because you just do not want to risk cross threading or stripping out any of these threaded areas. So we can see the new front bracket there, and now moving back, we can see we have the drain plug here, which definitely do not remove that. You're going to make a mess. But now we're going to remove these two 10mm bolts. Sorry, I'm having trouble saying millimeter today. Which this is the rear factory bracket for the factory skid protection. But that you do leave on, because that also cradles, I think this is the fuel pump down here or something related to that. So what I'm going to do is one at a time, just remove this 10mm bolt and then replace it with one of these rubber spacers that the new skid plate will mount to. And that's all there is to it. So now I'm going to do this other side. And these do thread in a decent amount farther than the factory bolts, but as I mentioned earlier, the threaded holes are deep enough for this, so I kind of like how he did this to just make everything a bit stronger. And there you go, just snug them up by hand. And now let's move to the next step. So now I'm back on the workbench because I've got a little bit of explaining to do, because this next step can be a little tricky if you haven't worked in this area before on the machine. So that's what this segment is all about. So we have this new bracket, which we'll install kind of near the rear of the oil pan, where it's the rearmost point where the new skid plate will attach. So it's a very nice sturdy bracket. As I said before, good quality, very nice paint on it. And it secures right to the chassis of the bike. It uses one of the bolt holes for the rear engine mount. So I like that he did this. So if you had a big hit on the skid plate, some of the force is going into the chassis and not the engine. Even though the engine is a stressed member, the whole front half is just supported by the oil pan on the engine, which it is designed that way, so it is very strong. But I just like that they added this just for kind of, you know, added strength, and it's just a good idea in my opinion. So now let me show you this bolt hole. So this is a real pain, or can be, on the exhaust side. And if we look in here, I'll get my finger to show you. You can see my finger. It's this 13 millimeter bolt right here. So you can see, you can get a 13 millimeter wrench up under, and that's the way I do it, and it's not too bad. So you can see here, I just went behind the exhaust, and it just, you can just get it right on the bolt there. A ratcheting wrench would make this way, way, way faster, but I don't have a 13 millimeter ratcheting wrench. Mine broke, so I'm back to the normal wrench, but that's besides the point. So this step, it's the same step when installing these lower heat crash bars, which I do have a video for that, which I will link in this video and in the description. And I go over, you know, how tricky that bolt is to get in and out. And a lot of installation videos I find online, they don't talk about how challenging that can be if you don't maybe have the right approach or the right tool for it. And I've heard of people even like dropping the exhaust, like doing, you know, a lot of work just to make that little bolt easier. But in my opinion, it's really not needed. It's not worth the time. This still only took me like 15 minutes once I figured out the right angle, which I will show you when I'm taking that out and putting the new one in. But I just wanted to mention that this is the only slightly tricky area to work in. And why I wanted to take a minute to explain this. You have the new bracket here, and these are the two bolts that secure it. So they come with these 5 millimeter spacers. If you do not have lower crash bars, then you will need to use these spacers, and they will look like this. You'll have the spacer on the inside of the bracket, because these are designed to be used, or can be used, with the HEED lower crash bars. So if you do have lower crash bars, you know, the HEEDs in particular, you will not use this spacer. So all you need to do is just use the normal bolt that it comes with, because the crash bar being there makes up that exact space, and this is designed just to fit right over it. So this spacer makes up for that not having it. So I do want to mention that. And then one other thing that will make things tricky for you if you install it incorrectly. We can see here, these holes are offset. So you can see this bolt hole is drilled, you know, on the right side of this piece of metal. So if you install this, you know, flip-flopped the wrong way, then these lower bolts aren't going to match up with the bolt holes, or these lower, you know, nutserts aren't going to match up with the bolt holes on the skid plate, which I could see that being a big problem. So the correct way to orientate this, I just double checked the instructions just to make sure I'm 100% in telling you this. So it'll be orientated like this. So the thicker part will be facing the rear of the motorcycle. So it'll be exactly like this, installed up under the bike with this offset hole, you know, towards the front of the machine. And just make sure to install it like that, and you'll have no issues with the final fitment. So now that we've got this topic and potential issues covered, I'm not going to use these because I have the HEED engine bars, and then I do need to apply a little bit of thread locker for these bolts. And now let's get to removing these bolts. So on the exhaust side here, as I mentioned before, you can just get the 13 millimeter right in from under and behind the exhaust. All you're going to do is crack that loose and just unscrew it and take it out. And then when you go to put it back in, that's where it can be a little tricky. You just kind of have to get a hand underneath, and you can kind of get a hand up in this area and just kind of use your fingers to start threading it in. And it's really just figuring out what approach works best. But all this is possible with just this basic cheap wrench I have in your hands. So definitely, you know, I definitely don't recommend messing with the exhaust or going to extra lengths to try and make this part a little bit easier for yourself. So now I'm on the left-hand side of the machine, the non-exhaust side. And I'm sorry for the goofy lighting. There's some sun coming through my shed window. So as you can tell, this is a very professional filming studio I'm in right now. But the other bolt you'll be working with, it's what secures this other lower guard, is right here, as you can see right there. And you can use just a 13 millimeter socket and extension. It would make this easier, but you can also use a normal 13 millimeter wrench. So you just get that on there and just remove it. So it is okay to just remove both of these at once, I mean, you have to anyways, but don't worry about like the engine, I guess, shifting or, you know, maybe getting loose. This one bolt we're working with is, there's at least one or maybe two others that also secure the mount that this goes through. So nothing will move, nothing will be loose when you undo that, so don't worry about that. So now I've got that bolt removed, which we can see it came out of right here. I didn't end up getting just a 13 millimeter socket and extension to make it a little bit easier, but it is possible with a normal wrench if that's all you have. So now we have the bracket here, which, as I said, it orientates like this with that offset hole, because we can see specifically on this side, when you align it, it gives room for the fuel line, or whatever line that may be, that runs next to it. So if you had it flipped around, then especially with the engine bars, the hole isn't even going to line up too well, and you're going to be risking rubbing against this line right here. So that is a note of caution as well, is when you do install this rear bracket, just make sure you have a good amount of clearance with these lines, and if you don't, I would say maybe guard them in some way or reposition them, so you make sure not have any issues with anything getting rubbed through. So what I'm going to do on this step is just get this aligned on both sides of the chassis here, and then just on this side, because it's very easy, get this bolt in and just barely snugged up, so then it'll hold this bracket up while we can attack the other side. And make sure too, as I said, I'm not using any spacers because I have these engine bars. If you do not have engine bars, just make sure you're able to get the spacers on the inside of this bracket and then the bolt through. So now we're on the exhaust side, which is the difficult side with this bolt. So I did get it threaded up in there. It took me, I would say, about 4 to 5 minutes. It was really no big deal once you get the angles kind of figured out. So I came up with the bolt from the bottom, and then also had a hand up top. Sometimes a hand up top, sometimes on the other side on the bottom. And I just kind of rocked it and flipped it to get it lined up with the hole, because it is very tight quarters in there. You do kind of have to angle it and kind of flip it into the hole, the bolt hole, so to speak. And this bottom bracket, so you can see here, it does fit very snugly on these mounting locations. So you may have to I had to keep some pressure on this towards the front of the machine to get the bolt hole to line up perfectly. So you may have to play with where this is angled and pushing it forward or back to make it make this be able to thread in easy. But once you get it all the way through and into the threaded hole, then you'll have enough room to get your wrench on it. So definitely don't try to thread it in until you can get your wrench over the front of the bolt, because if the bolt is so far out that you can't get this on it, then it's not in the threads. It's not touching the threads. So that's just a note, just to try to save you some time and frustration if you can't figure it out, so to speak. So now that we have this in here, what we're gonna do is leave this, kind of loose, so it can be angled, any which way, because obviously you need to make sure this lines up with the skid plate correctly. So now what I'm gonna do, and I recommend you doing, is put the skid plate up and just put 2 of the front bolt holes in, just so it lines up with those, and then thread these rear ones in, and just make sure that this is butted up correctly to the skid plate, that this sits flush and it's at the right angle. And once you do that, take the skid plate back down and then go back and tighten the 2 mounting bolts for this. because I'm unsure about the other side, the shifter side, but 100% on the exhaust side, once you put the skid plate up, you can't get to this bolt with a wrench, because you have to access it from the bottom with no skid plate. So that's what I'm going to recommend to do, so you don't have this at maybe like a wonky angle, and it's not, doesn't tighten up correctly. Okay, so putting up the skid plate here, those 4 shorter Allen bolts, just make sure they go into the rubber spacers, which are the 4 center bolt holes on the skid plate. So what I'm going to do is just put one through right now by hand, lift the plate up, and you can kind of see through the holes in the plate to get this lined up. What I'm going to do is use my boot. Give this a look under. This would definitely be a little easier with 2 people, but I'm just showing you it can be done by yourself. So as I said, now that you have these 2 in by hand, you can kind of get them snugged almost all the way. They are drilled, so you have a little bit of movement or adjustment. So now that I have those in, I'm gonna grab one of the other Allens that are slightly longer, because the slightly longer ones will go in here and here, and then the very rearmost points. And I will Loctite these at the end. This is just for demonstration purposes. I've got this threaded, and now this thing is, of course I'm throwing bolts everywhere. So now we've got these threaded in just by hand, and you can feel, if you put your hand up on the bottom of the plate, you can feel that the mounting bracket sits flat and nice and flush to the plate. Okay, so now I dropped the plate back down. I tightened up this rear bracket, which a note about that, you cannot tighten it on the exhaust side, as I mentioned, but with the skid plate on, you can get a socket on an extension and tighten the other side. So I'd recommend when you have this on as a template to align this bracket properly, just tighten the other side, so then this will stay in place at the correct, adjustment, and then as a final step, once you have the plate back off, just tighten up this exhaust side, and then you'll be good to go. So I've got the bolts laid out, how they exactly go on the plate. So you have you have 4 long ones and 4 short ones. You have 2 long ones at the back, 2 long ones at the front, and then the 4 short ones go in these center 4 holes on the plate, and I do have them prepped with a little bit of Loctite. So with that, thanks for watching this video. This has been Styx reporting from the shed, and I hope it was helpful or at least entertaining. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. And please leave a like and consider subscribing so you don't miss any more content. And now we'll finish out the video with just a little before and after video of how it looks on the bike.